Hello, everyone. How are you doing? And welcome to another episode of the Dr. Will Show. I am your host, Dr. Will. I am home, fresh out of a conference. I did my first Ignite session, one of the scariest moments of my life. Met Tom Murray offline, so it was awesome to have that happen. Uh, so we're back on the grind with the podcast, and we are here with Dr. Kristan Rodriguez, and we will be talking about leadership and innovation. So, Dr. Rodriguez, for those who are watching the show, will you please introduce yourself?
Oh, yes. Hi, my name is Kristan Rodriguez, and right now I'm focusing on working to support professional development in our region and have a consulting agency, Rodriguez Educational Consulting.
Y'all, she was a superintendent and just said deuces.
So I've had a lovely leadership journey. I began as a curriculum coordinator and moved into other positions: assistant principal, curriculum director for a district, assistant superintendent, and then superintendent.
Awesome. So thank you again for being a guest on the show. There's a lot of things that are going on in K through 12 education, and we're talking about all sorts of things floating around: funding and technology and testing and equity. What critical steps and sort of what are your thoughts in how do we move public education forward? Because if you look at how classrooms are sort of designed now, if you look at the curriculum, if you look at the school day, if you look at stuff like Carnegie units and all of those things, this stuff is still organized, scheduled, and structured the same way it was when I was in elementary school, and I'm 43 years old. So how do we change? Well, how do we make education more suited for the learning needs of current students and the economy we live in?
I think the first is to recognize that we're no longer in the information age. We're no longer in the industrial age, and we have to really think about the skills that our students need now are very different than when you and I were in school. We probably would have been at the same high school, looking at your age and my age. We went to school around the exact same time. And, it looked very similar when our parents went to school as well. It wasn't just our generation that we really haven't adapted our educational model in far too long. And so I think one of the things that we have to think about are what are the skills that our students need to be successful now. And those are not memorizing of facts or information sharing. They can get that from accurate online database searches. They no longer need us to stand up and lecture to them. We really need to be facilitators of their learning. We have to think about what kind of skills they need. They need critical thinking skills. They need strong communication skills. They need research and inquiry skills. These are the kind of skills that they need. And so we have to construct our environment and our classrooms differently in order to meet those expectations of those new skills. And we know that not only in what we're hearing from our business leaders that are telling us these are not the kinds of things we want our students to be coming out of our educational institutions with, but we also see how they interact with the world on a day-to-day basis. The communication that you and I are engaging in right now wouldn't have happened when we were in school. We wouldn't have been able to have a video conference call. And so these are the shifts and changes that we have to be thoughtful about in preparing our students. I think the other thing we have to really be thoughtful about is not just the IQ skills, but the emotional intelligence skills of our students. Do they persevere when they are struggling? This concept of growth mindset, right? Carol Dweck's work. And thinking about how our students are preparing themselves for frustration, challenge, failure, and how they can overcome those things. We really need to continue to invest. We've started to do that a lot more than we used to. Social emotional learning is becoming more at the forefront of our education. And a lot of people ask questions about that of us. Why are you engaging in those kinds of skills with your students during the school day? And what we're realizing is they need direct instruction in those strategies so that they can become successful in life. And then there's all those other things that you talked about that are impediments to our students, poverty, for example. I've started to do some real research around wraparound services. This concept of if our children are living in poverty, we need to provide some coordination for them to get them heat, to get them food, to get them proper dental and medical care. And in that respect, we're giving them an opportunity to close the opportunity gap. So we can, when they come to school, they're prepared to learn, so we can close that achievement gap for them.
Mm. So in the work that you do and have done, and in looking at how schools begin to become innovative, begin to move students forward in this economy, and everything that you just spoke of, what are the challenges that district leaders encounter when trying to move the entire organization, teachers, students, parents, other leaders in the district, in that direction?
I think the one thing that we sometimes forget as leaders is that we need to support the constituents, the stakeholders, the teachers, the students, the adults, the community leaders, the same way we expect in the classroom. We, for example, in the classroom, expect them to universally design in the districts that I worked with. We say you need to understand what those barriers to learning are and to success are, and you need to remove those barriers for your students. And so as leaders, we need to do the same thing for our constituents. So one of the best things that has worked for me in my leadership practice is simply not doing it in isolation and not doing it alone. So engaging in the work of understanding what the challenges are, doing authentic needs assessments of our practice and the outcomes of that practice for our students, doing that very collectively, not just even a representative sample, but you might have a small committee or a larger committee working, but then you vet that work with everyone in your community. All the teachers have access to what you're finding and can respond to that. Does that feel right to you? Does that look right to you? Embedding that into existing, for example, faculty meetings that they might have. This is what we think is happening. Is it, from your perspective, what you believe is happening? And then engaging them, including the students, in what we think we need to do to overcome what those challenges and barriers are for student learning. And that's going to be individualized and personalized, even for the stakeholders. You know, sometimes we know that people have resistance to change, and we often think, well, they're just, you know, they just don't want to do anything different. But there's always reasons why people have resistance to change. Some of it is fear. They don't think they have the capacity to change. You know, we might be using, for example, technologies that they're not comfortable with, you know, and so them saying, I don't want to do an online classroom or an online grading opening up to our parents for better communication might just be that they don't know how to utilize that technology. So we have to understand what those barriers for them are, and then we need to support. So I think collective inquiry, collective work to define strategy to overcome those challenges, and also providing them with the supports they need, I found that to be really successful.
Okay, so let me dive deeper into something you just spoke about. For those individuals, whether it be school-based leadership or teachers who are resistant. So the superintendent says, look, we're going one-to-one. Okay, we're bringing all these devices in. We're going to use Schoology or Canvas as our LMS. We want to shift to blended learning, go more paperless. And you do the right things in terms of you have instructional technologists who are there to provide ongoing support. You have a summer training before school starts to get teachers, to assist them with the onboarding process. So they're not just thrown devices and then, all right, you know, go do what you're going to do, Miss Williams. But you have those teachers who are like, look at my test scores. My students perform extremely well. My students go on to get into all of these colleges. I am nationally board certified. Why do I need to use these technologies, or why do I need to change? How do you work with those teachers? I know earlier you mentioned about they could have a fear, and you sort of remove those things. But when those teachers are adamant in terms of fighting back against the change you are trying to implement, how do you get them to see the benefit, or coach them up to a way to which they just say, this is the reality and I need to move with it?
I think a couple of things that I have found are strategies for success with that. I work in Massachusetts. We're a very high performing state. I work in worked in some of the best districts in Massachusetts. State performance ratings were the highest across the country, highest across the state. So when you implement change, there is always that question, it's working. Why would we adapt? Why would we make these changes? Two things. One, if I'm a superintendent implementing this shift, and as you said, kind of rolling it out across the district, I'm not sure I did my job right, because one, they should be engaged in the initial research and design of that framework, not hear about it from, well, this is what we're doing, and here we're rolling it out, and I've gotten some support for you. Two, I really believe that they are professionals. Educators are professionals, and they're thoughtful. And you have to acknowledge that what they're doing is working, right? If they are having success with their students, you have to acknowledge that and not want to throw that aspect away. You have to show to them and demonstrate to them that technology is just an additional tool. It's not replacing them or their expertise. It's just an additional tool that they can utilize in their practice. And the best way I've found to do that is to not start a whole district initiative straight out. It is to begin and scale it up and let their peers demonstrate and show. Those that are really invested initially up front first, those that are really comfortable with that, will volunteer to participate in pilots of one-to-one, for example. You might have whole teams. You might have a couple of teachers within a team. Let them play with it. Provide them the support materials and resources that work for them, and let them demonstrate to their peers the successes. Open up their classroom so they can see. You will find that they will, if it's an authentic and positive experience that results in student achievement with their peers, those teachers will be much more open to adapting their own practice. And then again, you personalize their own learning. So, a summer workshop is great. Technology integration specialists are great, but they also might need other things. They might need more coaching, for example, for the TIS staff to go in there. They might need personalized workshops. They might need hybrid models of professional development. They might need book studies. They might be a little more traditional. They may need some individualized professional development, how to access the actual devices before they can apply it. And then certainly they need to have conversations about, why are we doing this? It's not just because it's fun and fancy. It's because it authentically will help our students, offer them opportunities to enhance their own learning. You'll engage teachers when you care, when you talk about how this is going to help their kids and this is going to help them, as opposed to this is shiny new technology, everyone go ahead and do it.
Now, what you talk about is interesting, because there are two sort of examples that come to mind, but this is at the higher ed level. So one was Northwestern's journalism program. And I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, their dean said, we're moving towards digital because that's where our industry is going. And all of their alumni and students were like, what? We are a prestigious journalism school. We have won all these awards. Our alumni go and do all these great things. You are messing with our tradition. And he was like, newspapers are dying. Look at what's going to happening online. Look at what's happening in this space. We must prepare our students to write, to edit video, to shoot video, to work within that space, because that's where it's going. And the same thing happened with Harvard. Their dean came in and said, okay, the case method is awesome, but we're going to build a field experience into this MBA program. And people were like, what? What? Because the case study method was sanctimony to even talk about that. And he said, we're going to do it because our kids need real world experience when they get out there. And he said, we're doing it next semester. And people are like, what? You can't roll that out slowly? He said, no, because if I wait, it won't get done. So it's happening like now. And those were decisions that people made sort of, I guess, in the traditional form of leadership of, I make this decision, let's roll. Uh, in those cases, when those decisions are made, because I know you talked about cooperative leadership and people sort of working together, I'm wondering how, now both cases end up being successful for both universities, but in the case where you do have a superintendent who has worked with the, I guess, school board, and they have decided this is where we're going, and they did not practice what you talked about earlier in terms of bringing leadership in, bringing parents, how do they then get people on board when they have just pushed this out and they say, this is the law?
Yeah, I just don't practice that kind of leadership. So, I mean, I could give you techniques and things I've read in books, but I haven't found that successful. It's very much aligned to what the research says, engagement. So a lot of the research that I conduct, and part of why I wrote the book that I did, Universally Designed Leadership, was because I was seeing that we as leaders were making mistakes. We were not thinking about the different kinds of networks in our brain that are necessary to be lit up in order to have active, authentic learning and production. And so one of the three networks in the brain is the affective network, that network that is involved in engagement. And so you know, you can have compliance. People will do what you want them to do. They might enact it. But in order for there to be authentic engagement, they need to understand why this is important, why this works for them. They need to be invested in it. They need to be part of it. They need to feel like this, you know, they're in charge of their own work, and they're in charge of their own learning, both students and adults. And so, you know, I would look and say, I'm so happy that those models were effective for those leaders, but that's not my style of leadership. And in my style of leadership, I have found it highly successful when you engage the base and when you move at a pace that is appropriate. That doesn't mean years and years of moving forward. So when we implemented Universal Design for Learning, we started that only 2.5 years ago, and we started with a class of 15 educators, just a graduate level class of 15. The next year it was 25. The next year, 55 teachers took that course. And the amount of our staff that are participating in the concepts of Universal Design for Learning spread authentically. It was just a voluntary, you start with it, then we built a cohort, a cadre, then we created a committee to design plans around it, and the pace of implementation is actually quite swift, but it was thoughtful and engaging them in the process. The larger the district you have, I know sometimes it's easier to say, well, you know, there's just so many people, we can't engage them as authentically. I will say that I've had the benefit of working in smaller districts often, but at the same time, the principles of contribution exists the same. Teachers need to be at the table when we're making those decisions. We need to hear their voice. The resistance is just so much less. You're not constantly fighting against, why are we doing this? Oh, I don't want to do this. I can't do this. I feel pressured to do this, because they were part of the decision-making process, or their peers were part of the decision-making process, and we went back. There will always be some resistance, but the amount and time of energy of fighting that is so reduced if you just take it a little bit slower and engage more people in the development of it. But the pace of change doesn't have to be halted. It's just the process that you're taking.
Okay, so after leading such a change, how does a school district know if they've made the right decision?
You know, I think if you're really smart about your needs assessment, collectively understanding what your challenges are, you develop very smart goals, thinking about what measurements you're going to attain to understand what that success is. I think too many of us in K-12 do not engage in research, academic research. How many districts do you know that have a subscription to something like EBSCO, for example? And the administrators actually engage in peer-reviewed research before they make decisions? Or do too many of us look at what our neighbor does? Oh, that looks good. Okay, let's try that. Or I read this once in, you know, something on an online article or Google search. Let's try that. We really have to be a little bit more thoughtful and purposeful, I believe, collectively about what our needs are. We have to triangulate our data, understand that. Once we know what the antecedents are to our challenges, we need to find research based approaches and practices that meet that. And then we need to determine goals and set progress monitoring to see if we were successful. So for example, with Universal Design for Learning, we understood that we had a really dramatic gap between the students with disabilities, how they performed, versus all of our students. And so what we found was our gap was disproportionate to the performance of our students versus the state. And also to those comparable districts to us that the state said, these are your comparable districts, our gap was so much more disproportionate. And so by investing our energy, resources, and time in the approach, for example, for Universal Design for Learning, which is what we did, we saw a significant, measurable growth in the achievement of our students. So when we began this, what we call our annual PPI, Progress and Performance Index, it took into account statewide assessment measures, graduation rates, growth measures of our students, those types of norm reference data points and statewide data points. It's not the only thing we looked at. We also looked at our in-district benchmarks, our Fountas and Pinnell, AP, SAT data. So it wasn't just one data point, but this is one that I can use as an example. So we looked at our annual PPI, and just 2 years ago, it was hovering around high 40s, the PPI. So it's on a scale of 0 to 99. Our students with disabilities were around 47, 48. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it was not good in comparison to high 80s and 90s of all students. Now, all students also incorporated them. So you can see how significant the achievement gap was for those kids. Our state designates a PPI at 75 as level 1, which is the highest level. So you want to get your kids at least to a 71. What we found was over just 2 years, our students actually our students with disabilities surpassed the state level 1 status. So I want to say it was around 79 was their annual PPI in 2 years. So it was very easy to say measurable success, but we did it slowly. We didn't define it and give it down. We really rolled it in and incorporated it. And so now the teachers are energized. We're meeting the needs of these kids. These kids are succeeding. Our students actually performed above state averages on other norm tests. Our students with disabilities scored above all students' state averages on some of these other standardized measures as well, such as their SAT scores. They were performing students with disabilities above state averages. So I mean, their growth was significant in that time. So when we spent some time before we made the change, understanding what the needs were, and we found a research-based approach that met that need, outcomes that we highlighted, and we set those targets knowing we might not meet that. Those were going to be defined, and if we didn't meet that, we would just adjust our strategy. But we actually surpassed what we thought we would be able to do in the few years that I was there.
So on several occasions during this talk, you have mentioned UDL, and some of my guests may be watching and may not know what that is. I know another good book to sort of read about it is oh my gosh, they're going to get me now. They're going to get me now. Oh my gosh, they've been on my podcast before, and they have written a good book on it. Will you please define what UDL is, and then sort of maybe go into your book in terms of, well, I know, because yours is on leadership, but I know UDL is Universal Design and Learning. If you can kind of explain UDL, and then maybe kind of go into your book and why your book is so pertinent to districts moving in the right direction.
Sure. So Universal Design for Learning came out about 30 years ago out of Harvard. It was a cognitive neuroscientist, and what they did was they realized through their brain-based research that 3 networks in your brain need to light up in order for you to have authentic learning. And so I already talked to you about one of the networks that deals with engagement. So you have to really engage a learner in order for them to authentically learn. The other 2 areas are the ability to have multiple means of how we represent information to them. For example, some learners might need visual information. Others might need auditory. Some might need assistive technology to support barriers to them accessing of information. So you provide multiple means of knowledge and of information. So we call that multiple means of representation. The next is multiple means of action and expression, which means instead of giving kids multiple choice questions of the same information for mathematics, we allow them to represent what they're learning in different ways. We offer choice to them in how they want to represent their own learning. And the third, as I mentioned, really is around multiple means of engagement. How do we engage our kids? How do we, in all of these, addressing things like personalizing their own learning, creating mechanisms for them to design, for example, their own experiments. So you say, okay, here's the principle in physics. You design the experiment. I'm not going to give you a lab. I want you to develop a lab or an experiment to show this principle in action. It's also addressing things like executive functioning skills of our students. Skills do they need to be able to access it, minimizing threats and distractions for our students so that they can access their own learning. So all three of those networks in the brain need to be lit up. So when we design our lessons in our classroom, we have to be purposeful about designing to allow for choice. And not only in how they receive the information, but how they represent what they know. The concept of universal design for learning came from universal design out of architecture. So if you think about the concept of a sidewalk ramp, for example. So, architecture said, okay, we're going to create a sidewalk ramp. For the most part, they created a sidewalk ramp so that individuals with wheelchairs could access the sidewalk ramp. But then they realized it's not just people with wheelchairs. So there are other people that might need a ramp in the sidewalk, someone carrying a grocery cart, someone pushing a stroller, someone carrying luggage. They also can access the sidewalk with the sidewalk ramp. So we look at universal design for learning in the classroom as ramps in our classroom and in the learning. And so in this way, we're not saying, well, you have a disability or you have a learning need, and we're going to change and adjust how our classroom is set up just for you. We're going to pull you aside and just work with you and lower the amount of questions, for example, we ask. We say, no, we're going to design the lesson so that everyone in this classroom can access it. And even if a student doesn't have a specific, let's say, language-based disability, some of the engage in that supports language-based learners will help those students that could use it and may need it as well. So that's a universally designed approach to education. And what we realized, and the reason me and my co-author Katie Novak, who's written a couple of books on UDL, UDL Now is one of her very well-known books. And I think UDL in the Cloud is another one of her well-known books. We work together to kind of understand and unpack that the principles that work in the brain work for adults as well. Neuroplasticity occurs. So just because we age out of K-12 doesn't mean that we as adults can't learn. So when we work as leaders with our educators and other constituents, family and community, these practices work with them as well. So for example, when we design a faculty meeting agenda, we would design it like we would tell our teachers to design a lesson plan. And think about all three networks and make sure. So for example, my agenda might also be recorded. So I might send it to the staff ahead of time. And I might say to them, I want you to be involved. So here's a section. It's a Google form. You can fill it in. You tell us what are some things that you want to discuss and work on, in the faculty meeting. Meeting agendas completed, I would then record it. So people that want to hear it can hear it, maybe on their drive into work or whatnot. Those that want to read it can read it. Those that want to might be a video, they can see it that way. So again, it's making sure that we're thinking about those three networks in the brain. How are my faculty engaged in this in this faculty meeting? Am I just sitting here talking to them about things that I can do in a memo? Or are they participating, and do they care about the work that they're doing? Because their time is precious and we value their time. So this is what our book does. It says, how do you how do you understand UDL and how it applies to leadership practices, and then provide some examples of how that works in terms of professional development, universally designing our professional development, in terms of strategy development for our departments or our districts or our schools, family and community engagement, faculty meetings, things, very practical things that administrators do. We took that research that's well above my head, those neuroscientists, and brought it down to applications in the field.
Awesome. Oh, echo. I just remembered that the book is UDL Personalized Learning, Barbara Bray and Karen McClaskey. So I was like, so I had to get it.
You had to get it. You had to get it.
I had to get it out there. So before we go, I would like your call to action for K through 12 leaders who are confronting the fact that they must change or become irrelevant. And whether that means going one-to-one or BYOD, whether that is coming out with more personalized approach to learning, changing their schedule, school calendar, what have you, but they're unsure of how to make this happen. Because, all of us, you go to school, you're taught a certain way to do something, and then you get into the workplace, and that workplace will train you sort of how to do that job at that specific place. And if you stay there long enough, you have these routines of this is how I do it. And now when you are sort of confronted, especially the leader, to overhaul something that has been, this thing has been the same thing 5 to 10 years of now. And now I have to turn this thing in a whole new direction. What is your call to action for them so that they can not only be effective, but do so in a way where they're at peace and the people around them champion the move as well?
Well, I would say, first of all, the fact that they're thinking about that, they should feel proud of themselves. They should congratulate themselves for not just accepting where they're at, but wanting to be innovative, wanting to pursue. They should be celebrated for that. Leadership is often a very lonely profession. And so what I would say to them is reach out. I mean, with technology now, they don't have to just reach out to the neighboring district or the few that they know. Join professional learning networks online, in ed camps and other areas of interest. So whatever they believe those areas are that they need to pursue, there are groups that are also pursuing that, are also looking at that. I would say before they even begin thinking about what those innovative practices are, take a step back and make sure that's why and what they should be doing. Is it really going to be better for their kids? Is it really meeting the challenge of the needs of the actual district versus something that's just fun and flashy? Make sure that it's purposeful and thoughtful. And do their research. Really, like I said, I don't think enough of us do peer-reviewed research, looking at what the science and the research tells us we should be doing. And then once they feel confident in that research, then expand their network as leaders. Once they have done some of their own research and understanding collectively with their staff, I think they need to bring a representative group to the learning and allow them also to be up at the same pace and rate as they are, so that when they engage in the innovative practices, they again aren't on high down telling, I know best, this is what we need to do, but hey, we know that this is the right thing for us to do. So whatever that is, whether it's looking at our schedules and adapting them, which we need to be a little bit more thoughtful about, right? A lot of research has come out, for example, and says, how early our high schools are. And is that really the best thing for the brains of growing teenagers who were sleeping too little. And, you know, are we offering kind of blended opportunities for our students to access it? Looking now more on dual enrollment and, you know, the pace to which we educate. Is it just by your age that you're in this class and that you're set? Or is it based on your ability and desire to learn in that subject area, being flexible around that? The concept of one-to-one devices and other things. You know, we want to make sure that my colleague Alan November, who you may know, he and I were speaking the other day, and one of the things that he often says, and I've heard him say it a couple of times, is technology is not a really expensive pen and paper. If we look at it that way, we have kind of lost the direction of what we want to use technology for, and that is to make students the owners of their own learning. So again, whatever that thing is that we believe deeply, if we do it collaboratively, we'll be successful. No one leader will ever know how to innovate and think and be successful alone, and they shouldn't feel like they have to. I always say we're all superheroes, but sometimes we've got to take the cape off and understand our own, that we're learning, and give ourselves a break and allow ourselves to learn from the research and from one another.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you again for being on the show. This has been one of those conversations that I will definitely go back and rewatch again and again. So for those who are watching the show, as always, you know this will be on, I'm going to pop this on LinkedIn. I'm going to put this on my blog. This will go on SoundCloud. It always will be on YouTube. And of course, I'll be tweeting this out and sharing it. And there'll be information to be able to get in contact with Dr. Rodriguez online. So as always, people, invest in you, eat you, peace.